One mission, Artemis II. 4 astronauts sent toward the Moon with a known 50% risk of failure. This is the Orion spacecraft carrying them beyond Earth on a system already proven to fail once. Today we uncover why NASA launched anyway. A. Mission-driven, not by uncertainty but by known, documented danger. And one question above all, why did it still happen? Now let's begin. 1 in 2. Not the odds of winning a hand of blackjack in Las Vegas. Not the survival rate after a complicated open-heart surgery performed at a top-tier hospital. 1 in 2 was the estimated probability of mission failure for a spacecraft carrying 4 living human beings to the Moon. And that number came not from a fringe critic, not from a conspiracy blogger, but from the program manager of the rocket itself during an official technical briefing months before launch. Let that sit for a moment. When a surgeon tells a patient there is a 50% chance of not surviving an operation, hospitals have entire ethical and legal frameworks built around that disclosure. Patients sign forms, family members are notified, chaplains are called. The gravity of that probability is treated with the full weight of human mortality. But on April 1st, 2026, 4 human beings strapped themselves into a spacecraft with odds that no casino would post on a board, no insurance company would underwrite, and no rational framework of institutional risk management would ever approve, and the agency responsible for their lives had known about the root cause of that risk for nearly 3 years before the engines ignited. This is not a story about a technical malfunction that no one saw coming. Those stories are tragedies of ignorance. What happened with Artemis II is something far more unsettling, a tragedy of knowledge. NASA knew. The evidence was documented, photographed, analysed and filed. The warnings were written down by credentialed engineers with decades of experience. The failure mode had a name, a mechanism and a paper trail stretching back to December of 2022. And yet on the evening of April 1st, 2026 at 6:35, in the evening Eastern Time, the most powerful rocket ever to carry human beings left the ground anyway. To understand why that happened and why it matters far beyond the boundaries of aerospace engineering, consider a thought experiment that requires no scientific background whatsoever. Imagine that Boeing, during a routine post-flight inspection, discovers that the wings of a commercial airliner have developed structural cracks, not hairline fractures that require monitoring, but visible photographable damage in a load-bearing component. Imagine that engineers document the cracks, photograph the damage extensively, and submit detailed reports to management. Now imagine that those photographs are locked away for over a year. No public disclosure, no grounding of the aircraft, no replacement of the damaged component. And then imagine that 4 passengers board that specific plane fully aware of the cracks, fully briefed on the risk, and fully unable to do anything about the fundamental engineering problem beneath their feet. That is not a hypothetical designed to be dramatic. That is, with technical precision adjusted for aerospace context, exactly what happened with Artemis II. The component in question was the Orion capsule's heat shield, the curved barrier of ablative material that stands between the crew and temperatures approaching 3,000 degrees Celsius during atmospheric re-entry. On the previous uncrewed test flight Artemis I, that heat shield came back damaged in ways that no computer model had predicted and no ground tests had suggested. Over 100 locations showed unexpected erosion. Large chunks of protective material had been physically ejected from the surface. Deep gouges had been carved into layers that were never designed to be exposed to re-entry heat. The photographs of that damage were alarming by any engineering standard, and NASA did not release them for 14 months. But here is where the story expands beyond a single spacecraft and a single decision. The 1 in 2 probability, the suppressed photographs, the decision to fly anyway. These are not aberrations produced by uniquely reckless individuals making uniquely bad choices on a uniquely difficult day. They are the output of a system with a long history, a system with a documented pattern of behavior that has expressed itself before in different hardware, under different administrators, with consequences measured in human lives. The Artemis II heat shield is not the beginning of this story. It is the latest chapter of one that started decades ago and has never truly been resolved, because what is really at stake here is not just the survival of 4 astronauts. It is the question of how a civilization decides what a human life is worth when the thing threatening that life is not ignorance or accident, but institutional momentum, the slow bureaucratic gravity of a program too expensive to pause, too politically entangled to delay, and too symbolically loaded to cancel. When ambition and safety point in opposite directions, which one wins? The answer on April 1st, 2026 was visible to anyone willing to look directly at it. 4 people climbed into that capsule knowing every detail of the risk. They had read the engineering reports, they had attended the briefings, they knew about the 14 months of silence and the photographs that had been locked away. They knew that the experts most qualified to evaluate the heat shield's failure mode had publicly stated that the vehicle should not carry a crew. And they signed their names on the wall of the White Room at the top of the launch tower, a tradition dating back generations, and strapped in anyway. That choice, and the institutional machinery that made it necessary, is what this story is really about. But the cracked heat shield is only the surface of something far deeper. Beneath it lies an organizational secret that NASA has carried for decades, a pattern of behavior that has surfaced before, that has killed before, and that some of the most credentialed voices in American aerospace, I believe, was operating. Again, on the morning of April 1st, 2026. Imagine throwing a rock into a still lake, not at a gentle arc, but straight down at the speed of sound. The water does not have time to part and flow around it. The impact is so sudden, so violent, that the water beneath the rock compresses into something almost solid. Now replace the lake with air, replace the rock with a spacecraft the size of a large camper van, and replace the speed of sound with 25 times the speed of sound. That is atmospheric re-entry. The air molecules at 70 miles of altitude are sparse enough that in everyday terms they barely register as a gas, but at 40,000 kilometers per hour, barely. There becomes a wall of compressed plasma that reaches temperatures rivaling the outer layers of the sun. The heat does not come from friction between the spacecraft and the air the way a match head creates heat by scraping against a rough surface. It comes from compression. The air simply cannot move out of the way fast enough, so its molecules pile into each other with such force that the kinetic energy of the collision converts directly into thermal energy. The spacecraft does not burn through the air burns because of the spacecraft. This is the physics that the Orion heat shield exists to defeat. And to understand why its failure on Artemis I was so alarming, it helps to understand what makes Orion fundamentally different from every spacecraft that faced this same problem before it. The Apollo Command Module, which carried astronauts home from the Moon between 1969 and 1972, weighed approximately 5,800 kilograms at re-entry. The Orion capsule, by comparison, weighs close to 10,000 kilograms under similar conditions. That difference is not a footnote. In the physics of atmospheric entry, mass is everything. A heavier vehicle hits the upper atmosphere with greater kinetic energy, compresses the air more violently, generates higher peak temperatures, and subjects its heat shield to forces that scale non-linearly with weight. The difference between the Apollo capsule and Orion is not the difference between a bicycle and a slightly heavier bicycle. It is closer to the difference between a bicycle and a fully loaded sport utility vehicle, and both are being driven into a concrete barrier at the same speed. The laws of physics do not offer a discount for ambition. NASA's engineers knew this. Their solution was a heat shield made from a material called avcoat, an ablative substance designed to char and slowly vaporize during re-entry, carrying thermal energy away from the spacecraft in a controlled layer by layer. Sacrifice. The design logic is elegant. Instead of trying to block the heat, you absorb it and eject it. The outer surface of the shield burns away so that the structure behind it does not. The problem was not the material. The problem was the architecture. The original Apollo heat shields were constructed as a single continuous honeycomb matrix, roughly 320,000 individual hexagonal cells, each filled with avcoat, all bonded together into one unbroken surface. That design had been tested exhaustively and had carried 12 human beings home from the Moon without a catastrophic failure. But for Orion, program engineers chose a fundamentally different approach. Rather than one continuous surface, the Orion heat shield was assembled from approximately 180 individual blocks of avcoat, each bonded separately to a carbon fiber backing structure. No spacecraft had ever flown a segmented heat shield of this design at lunar return velocities. There was no flight heritage for it. No one had ever brought one back from the Moon and checked what it looked like afterward. Think of the difference between tiling a kitchen floor with individual ceramic squares versus pouring a single slab of continuous concrete. Both can look identical from above, but their behavior under stress is governed by entirely different mechanics. The grout lines between tiles are the weakest points. Under sufficient load, they crack first. And the gaps between Avcoat blocks, it turned out, created pathways for gases to behave in ways the computer models had not fully anticipated. During the intense heating of re-entry, gases became trapped inside the Avcoat blocks themselves. As temperatures climbed into ranges that would vaporize most metals, those gases expanded. The pressure built against the internal structure of the material. And then not smoothly, not gradually, not in the controlled layer-by-layer ablation the design intended, the material cracked. Chunks ejected, gouges opened. Areas of the heat shield that were designed to be a last line of defense against temperatures capable of incinerating steel were left exposed, scarred, and structurally compromised. Think of it this way: place a sealed carbonated beverage can inside a microwave oven and activate it. The liquid inside begins to heat. Gases expand under pressure. The can does not slowly soften and deflate in a controlled manner. It ruptures at whatever structural weak point gives way first, suddenly and violently. That is not a perfect analogy for the chemistry involved, but it captures the essential failure mode pressure building inside a sealed volume until the containing structure can no longer hold it. When NASA technicians pulled the Orion capsule from the Pacific Ocean after Artemis I and brought it into the processing facility at Kennedy Space Center, they found a heat shield that looked as though it had been subjected to forces well beyond its design parameters. More than 100 discrete locations showed unexpected erosion. The surface was pockmarked with voids where material had been physically ejected. 4 separation bolts had partially melted through their thermal protection barriers, components that were never supposed to reach the temperatures they clearly had. And NASA did not release photographs of any of this for 14 months. When the first official acknowledgement came in March of 2023, the language chosen by program officials was calibrated to minimize alarm. There had been more variation than expected. The material had ablated differently than models predicted. These statements were technically true and contextually misleading in a way that required skill to achieve. The photographs behind those carefully chosen words showed something that the global aerospace engineering community, when it finally saw them more than a year later, following the NASA Inspector General's report, described not with measured technical language, but with something closer to stunned silence. The damage was not variation, it was failure, and the silence surrounding it was not an oversight, it was a decision. If you were the engineer who first photographed those gouges, who first measured the depth of those ejection voids, who first understood what those numbers meant for the next mission, and your supervisor told you to keep the findings internal, while the agency determined how to proceed, what would you do? Hold the photograph, look at the damage, and decide whether the professional obligation to the institution that employs you outweighs the professional obligation to the 4 human beings whose names are already being assigned to the next flight. There was one engineer who made his choice clearly, publicly, and at significant personal cost. He did not stay silent. And the decision he made to speak directly to the press, to use his own name, to draw comparisons that no one inside the building wanted drawn, may have changed the outcome of the mission entirely. Or it may have simply meant that when the heat shield failed again, at least someone had said so on the record. There is a specific kind of courage that rarely gets celebrated. Not the courage of someone who has never seen the worst happen, but the courage of someone who has seen it up close, survived it, studied it for years afterward, and is now watching the conditions that produced it quietly reassemble themselves in a new context. That is the courage Charles Kamada demonstrated when he went public about the Artemis II heat shield. And to understand why his voice carried a weight that no other critics could, it helps to understand exactly who he is and what he has already survived. Kamada holds a doctorate in engineering. He spent decades at NASA working specifically on thermal protection systems, the engineering discipline that determines whether a spacecraft survives the most violent phase of any mission. He was not a manager who reviewed spreadsheets from a corner office. He was a technical specialist who understood at the level of material science and fluid dynamics precisely how heat shields fail and precisely what those failures look like before they become catastrophic. In 2005, he flew aboard Space Shuttle Discovery on the first crewed mission after the Columbia disaster. a flight that the entire aerospace world watched with something close to held breath, because the vehicle being flown was the same design that had killed 7 people 2 years earlier. Discovery carried him to orbit and brought him home, but the experience did not make him cavalier about thermal protection systems. It made him permanently professionally incapable of dismissing warning signs in that specific domain. When Kamada looked at the photographs of the Artemis I heat shield, the images that had been withheld from public view for over a year, he was not looking at them the way a journalist looks at damage, or the way a politician looks at a liability. He was looking at them the way a cardiac surgeon looks at an X-ray that shows a crack in a patient's sternum 3 days after open heart surgery. He knew the anatomy, he knew what healthy looked like, and he knew with clinical precision that what he was seeing was not healthy. But here is what made his objection fundamentally different from that of a cautious outsider raising general concerns. Kamada was not afraid of spaceflight. He had strapped himself to a rocket after Columbia, knowing full well that the vehicle's thermal protection system had already proven it could kill. His opposition to Artemis II was not born from timidity or an abstract preference for caution. It was born from the recognition of a specific failure mechanism, gas entrapment, leading to internal pressure buildup, leading to material ejection, and the specific institutional response to evidence of that failure mechanism, which he recognized from experience as insufficient. Consider a parallel that requires no engineering background. A cardiac surgeon with 30 years of experience witnesses a patient die on the table because a surgical instrument fractured mid-procedure, a hairline crack that had been visible on preoperative inspection but was classified as within acceptable tolerance. The surgeon documents the incident, submits a formal report, and recommends that instruments showing similar crack patterns be retired from service. 2 years later, at a different hospital, that same surgeon sees the same instrument, same design, same crack pattern being prepared for use in a scheduled operation. Professional obligation does not ask that surgeon to stay quiet and trust the new hospital's tolerance assessment. Professional obligation demands they speak. That is the position Kamada was in, and that is why he did not stay quiet. What he said publicly was precise and deliberate. He described the heat shield as exhibiting deviant behavior, a specific technical term, meaning the component was performing outside its qualified design envelope in ways that had not been fully characterized or corrected. He stated that the computational models NASA was using to argue the Artemis II re-entry would be survivable were the same models that had failed to predict the Artemis I damage in the first place. Using a broken instrument to certify that the instrument is not broken is not an engineering methodology. It is motivated reasoning dressed in technical language. And Kamada said so, clearly using his name in a public forum. NASA's institutional response was not to engage his technical arguments directly. It was not to publish a point-by-point rebuttal addressing his specific claims about the failure mechanism or the adequacy of the computational models. What happened instead was considerably more elegant and considerably more telling. He was invited into rooms, his concerns were acknowledged, his expertise was respected in tone and gesture, and then the plan continued exactly as it had before he spoke on the same timeline with the same hardware toward the same launch date. The organization performed the ritual of listening without altering the outcome of what it had already decided to do. This is not an accusation of dishonesty. It is a description of a phenomenon that behavioral scientists have documented extensively in high-stakes organizations. Under schedule pressure, the tendency to process dissenting information through a filter that preserves the existing conclusion. The meeting happens, the objection is recorded, the box is checked, and the momentum continues. There is a moment in this story that deserves its own pause because it contains a kind of institutional irony that would be funny if the stakes were not measured in human lives. At one of the technical review meetings where the heat shield's performance was being assessed, NASA engineers presented computer simulation results demonstrating that the direct re-entry trajectory would produce manageable, survivable damage. The simulations were detailed, the visualizations were sophisticated. The confidence intervals were documented, and the software used to generate those results was in substantial part the same computational framework that had been used before Artemis I, the same framework that had predicted a heat shield performance that bore little resemblance to what actually came back from the moon. Using the tool that failed to anticipate the problem as the primary evidence that the problem has been solved is the scientific equivalent of checking whether a clock is showing the correct time by comparing it to itself. The clock cannot tell you it is broken. Only something outside the clock can do that. When a senior expert with a doctorate in the relevant engineering discipline direct flight experience on the most dangerous mission in the vehicle's history and years of post-Columbia investigation work tells an organization that the conditions for failure are present, and that the organization responds by presenting computer models as the definitive counterargument. The question that deserves an honest answer is a simple one. When a senior expert warns about a life-threatening danger in precise technical terms, and the institution responds with confidence in its own internal analysis, who should be trusted more? Kamada was not the only person inside or adjacent to the aerospace community who shared his alarm. The concerns he articulated in public were echoed privately by others whose names did not appear in press releases. And the foundation beneath all of those concerns, the reason they carried a gravity that went beyond one engineer's opinion about one component on one spacecraft, was a historical record that the agency had never fully escaped. A record that did not begin with Artemis. A record written in two separate disasters 14 years apart, by the same institutional pattern expressing itself through different hardware. There is a category of organizational failure that is more dangerous than incompetence, more insidious than corruption, and more difficult to correct than simple ignorance. Competent, well-intentioned, genuinely skilled people are involved at every level. The data exists. The warnings are filed. The meetings are held. And at the end of the process, the decision that emerges is the wrong one, not because anyone lied or cheated or failed to do their job, but because the system they were operating inside was designed through its incentive structures and its social dynamics to produce that specific wrong decision under exactly those specific conditions. Behavioral scientists call the cognitive component of this phenomenon groupthink. But that term, familiar enough to have become almost comfortable, fails to convey what it actually costs when the organization in question is building rockets. On July 31, 1985, 6 months before Space Shuttle Challenger was destroyed, 73 seconds after launch, a senior engineer at Morton Thiokol named Roger Boisjoli submitted a formal internal memo to his management chain. The memo was not vague, it was not speculative. Boisjoli described in technical detail the behavior of the rubber O-ring seals used to prevent hot combustion gases from escaping the joints of the solid rocket boosters. He had observed across multiple previous flights evidence of erosion and partial blow-by in those seals, the conditions that the design specifications did not account for, and that represented in his professional judgment a trajectory toward catastrophic joint failure. He used the word catastrophic. He put his name on it. He submitted it through official channels. The memo was acknowledged, filed, and did not change the program's operational posture. On the morning of January 28, 1986, temperatures at Kennedy Space Center dropped to 36 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, conditions that Boisjoli and his colleagues had specifically argued would compromise the O-ring's ability to seal under launch. Loads. Engineers at Morton Thiokol attempted to delay the launch the night before. Their recommendation was overruled in a management telephone conference. The launch proceeded. 73 seconds after liftoff, hot combustion gases burned through the compromised O-ring joint on the right solid rocket booster. The external tank ruptured. 7 crew members died. The warning had been in writing for 6 months. It was specific, technical, and correct, and it did not stop what happened. 14 years later, on February 1, 2003, Space Shuttle Columbia broke apart during re-entry over Texas and Louisiana. 7 crew members died. The cause was a piece of insulating foam that had separated from the external tank during launch 81 seconds after liftoff and struck the reinforced carbon-carbon panels on the leading edge of the left wing, punching a breach that superheated plasma entered during re-entry, destroying the wing from the inside and triggering the vehicle's disintegration. During the 16 days Columbia spent in orbit between launch and re-entry, an engineer named Rodney Rocha sent a formal request through NASA's internal communication channels asking that the Department of Defense be contacted to use reconnaissance satellite capabilities to image the wing and assess the extent of potential damage. The request was reviewed by mission management. The determination made was that even if significant damage were confirmed, no repair capability existed and no rescue mission could be mounted in the available time frame. Therefore, the information would only cause distress without enabling action. The request was denied. The wing was never imaged. 16 days after launch, 7 people died during re-entry in a thermal failure of the exact component that Rocha had flagged for inspection. 2 disasters. 14 years apart. Different vehicles, different components, different technical failure modes. But look at the organizational sequence that preceded each one, and the pattern is not merely similar, it is structurally identical. An engineer identifies a specific documented risk. The warning is submitted through official channels. Management acknowledges the concern and continues with the existing plan. The system produces the outcome the engineer predicted. The investigation that follows identifies the same institutional dynamics: schedule pressure, the filtering of bad news before it reaches decision makers, the normalization of known anomalies because previous flights had survived them, and a reward structure that systematically advantages optimism over caution, warning, acknowledgement, inaction, disaster, investigation, promises, repetition. Now consider what a straightforward question reveals when applied to the Artemis II heat shield. Engineers documented unexpected and severe damage after Artemis I. The documentation was suppressed for 14 months. A computational framework that had failed to predict the damage was used to argue that a modified re-entry trajectory would make the damage manageable. A former astronaut and thermal protection systems expert publicly stated that the vehicle should not carry a crew. The Flight Readiness Review produced a unanimous go vote. The launch proceeded. The pattern does not require conspiracy to operate. It does not require bad people making consciously bad choices. It requires only a system whose incentive structure rewards the people who find reasons to say go and creates professional friction, subtle, unspoken, entirely deniable for the people who find reasons to say not yet. When a person's career advancement depends on a program meeting its schedule, the human brain is extraordinarily creative at finding legitimate-sounding technical justifications for the conclusion it has already been incentivized to reach. This is not a character flaw, it is a well-documented feature of human cognition under motivated conditions. The problem is not that NASA employs dishonest people. The problem is that NASA built a system that asks honest people to make decisions inside a framework that systematically distorts the inputs to those decisions. Every organization that has ever failed in this specific way had people inside it who knew something was wrong. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board documented them. The Rogers Commission documented them after Challenger. They were there, their concerns were filed, their voices were in the record. And the institution moved forward anyway. Not because it was malicious, but because the gravitational pull of sunk costs, schedule pressure, political visibility and budget dependency created a force that individual technical objections, no matter how credentialed and how correct, could not overcome from inside the system. An organization that has lived through 2 catastrophic failures produced by the same institutional pattern and that has not restructured, the incentive architecture that generates that pattern has not actually learned from those failures. It has learned to talk about them. There is a significant difference. When a single organizational pattern has produced 2 disasters separated by nearly 2 decades, disasters that killed 14 people, grounded the entire shuttle fleet, cost billions in investigation and remediation, and generated thousands of pages of formal findings, why does that pattern persist? But in the middle of all this institutional darkness, 4 actual human beings made a choice to sit on top of that cracked shield anyway. And the reasons why they made that choice are more complicated than any physics equation ever written. There is a version of this story where the 4 people who climbed into the Orion capsule on the evening of April 1st, 2026 are portrayed as larger-than-life figures, fearless, almost superhuman, the kind of individuals who simply do not experience the ordinary, calculations of self-preservation that govern the rest of us. That version is easier to tell. It is also dishonest in a way that does a profound disservice to what these 4 people actually did. The truth is more complicated and far more remarkable. Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen were not people who climbed aboard Orion in ignorance of the risk. They were not shielded from the uncomfortable data by well-meaning managers who wanted to protect crew morale. They had read the engineering reports. They had attended the technical briefings where the Artemis I heat shield damage was described in precise, unsparing detail. They knew the 1 in 2 probability figure. They knew the institutional history of Challenger and Columbia, not as abstract cautionary tales from a distant past, but as documented case studies that had been formally presented to them as context for understanding the current program's risk posture. They had access to every dissenting voice, every flagged anomaly, every reason that existed to say no, and then they said yes. That is not the absence of fear. That is something considerably harder to define and considerably more worth examining. Reed Wiseman commanded the mission. He is a former Navy fighter pilot, a graduate of the Naval Test Pilot School, and a veteran of combat deployments in multiple theatres. He has spent his professional life in environments where the cost of a wrong decision is measured in seconds and lives. He is also a single father of 4 children. Before he walked to the launch pad on April 1, 2026, he wrote a letter by hand to each of his 4 children, 4 separate envelopes, 4 separate letters, and left them with a family member with a single instruction: open them only if he does not come home. Take a moment with that. This is not the act of someone who has not considered the possibility of not returning. This is the act of someone who has considered it with complete clarity, prepared for it with deliberate care, and chosen to go anyway. The letters exist. The envelopes were sealed. The possibility they represent was real and acknowledged and set aside, not dismissed, not denied, but consciously placed in a drawer so that the man who wrote them could walk to a rocket with steady hands. Victor Glover brought something to this mission that no person in human history had ever brought to deep space before he became the first person of colour to travel beyond low Earth orbit. Not the first black astronaut to reach orbit, that milestone had been crossed decades earlier, but the first to leave the gravitational neighbourhood of Earth entirely and travel into the space between worlds. That distinction did not arrive by accident or coincidence. Glover accumulated more than 3,500 hours of flight time in military aircraft. He flew 24 combat missions. He executed more than 400 carrier-arrested landings, a procedure that involves catching a wire at the end of an aircraft carrier deck at high speed, a maneuver that compresses the human body so violently that even experienced pilots describe it as a controlled crash. He conducted 4 spacewalks during 168 days aboard the International Space Station. When Victor Glover says he understands risk, he is not speaking metaphorically. He has personally tested the limits of what the human body and the hardware around it can endure repeatedly, professionally, across a career built on controlled exposure to danger. He understood the odds on April 1, 2026 with the same precision. He understood the approach speed for a carrier landing in adverse weather conditions. Christina Koch's biography contains a detail that most profiles mention briefly and then move past, but which deserves considerably more attention. Long before she was selected as an astronaut, before she had any reasonable expectation of leaving Earth's atmosphere, Koch sought out and accepted postings at some of the most isolated research stations on the planet. She worked at the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station in Antarctica, a facility where during the austral winter no aircraft can land for months. No evacuation is possible regardless of medical emergency, and the team of researchers present must function as a completely self-sufficient unit, with no outside assistance available. She did not end up in those places because her career path required it. She pursued them. The psychology of that choice is worth sitting with. Koch was years before her first spaceflight, deliberately training her mind to function under the precise conditions that the far side of the moon would impose. Conditions where the nearest help is not slow or difficult to reach, but physically impossible to contact. She was not stumbling toward Artemis II. She was walking toward it from a very long way back, having spent years methodically removing every psychological obstacle that stood between her and that specific kind of solitude. Jeremy Hansen's situation contains its own particular weight. Artemis II was his first spaceflight, not his most ambitious spaceflight, not the culmination of a long series of progressively challenging missions. His first. The first time Hansen would leave Earth's surface would also be the farthest any human being had ever travelled from it. The analogy that captures this most honestly is not flattering to the comfort of the listener. Imagine that someone has studied driving exhaustively, logged thousands of hours in simulations, demonstrated exceptional aptitude in every controlled test environment available, and then their very first time behind the wheel of an actual vehicle, they are handed the keys to a 40-ton articulated truck and asked to navigate a mountain pass in a blizzard, in the dark. With 4 lives depending on the outcome, Hansen agreed to those terms. He did not ask for a more gradual introduction to the experience of leaving the planet. He accepted the assignment, completed the training, and on April 1st, 2026, strapped himself into a spacecraft that was about to travel farther from Earth than any human being in recorded history, for the very first time. There is a moment of unintentional honesty embedded in the logistics of the Artemis II mission that cuts through the epic framing of everything surrounding it. Among the items carefully packed and stowed aboard the Orion capsule for 10 days of deep space travel were 10 days of freeze-dried meals selected through months of pre-mission planning, biological experiment hardware worth millions of dollars, emergency medical equipment, and a comprehensive operating manual for the spacecraft's waste management system, a document that a dedicated team of engineers spent approximately 3 years developing, testing, and refining. 3 years. For a toilet. This is not a criticism. The waste management system aboard a spacecraft sealed against the vacuum of space operated in microgravity by 4 people for 10 days with no maintenance support available is a genuine engineering challenge that genuinely required that investment. But it is a useful corrective to any tendency to view space exploration as an activity conducted entirely at the level of cosmic grandeur. The universe does not suspend the ordinary requirements of human biology because the backdrop is spectacular. The engineers understood this. The crew understood this. Space exploration is simultaneously the most extraordinary thing our species does, and at the operational level, a meticulous management of extremely mundane physical necessities. There is no improvisation. There is no winging it. There is a 3-year manual for every contingency, including the ones that feel embarrassing to discuss in the context of breaking distance records. These 4 people, a single father who wrote goodbye letters to his children, a combat pilot who became the first person of color to leave low Earth orbit, a scientist who spent years voluntarily living in the most isolated places on Earth, and a rookie whose debut flight went directly to the farthest point any human had ever reached, did not board that capsule because they had failed to understand the risk. They boarded it because they had understood it completely, processed it fully, and arrived at a conclusion that no engineering equation and no probability calculation can produce on its own. Is there a meaningful difference between courage and recklessness? Or is that boundary only ever defined in retrospect once the outcome is known? They boarded the capsule. The most powerful rocket ever to carry human beings began its final countdown. And what happened in the 8 minutes that followed would either reposition humanity's place in the universe or prove that we were not yet ready for the address. There is an energy figure associated with the launch of the Space Launch System that most coverage of Artemis II never mentions, because the number is so large it stops feeling real the moment it is stated. The total energy released during the 8 minutes of powered ascent from the moment the engines ignited at Kennedy Space Center to the moment the core stage cut off at the edge of space is roughly equivalent to the entire electrical energy consumption of the city of Los Angeles over 3 consecutive days. Every refrigerator, every air conditioning unit, every street lamp, every hospital, every data center, every charging cable, in a metropolitan area of 4 million people running continuously for 72 hours. All of that energy concentrated into 8 minutes for the sole purpose of lifting 4 human beings and their spacecraft high enough and fast enough to escape the lower atmosphere. The scale of what a rocket launch actually requires expressed in those terms is not inspiring in the way launch photographs are inspiring. It is closer to unsettling. The sequence of events during those 8 minutes follows a choreography so precisely engineered that describing it as a plan understates the level of obsessive specificity involved. At the moment of ignition, the 4 RS-25 liquid engines at the base of the core stage fired first, building to full thrust over approximately 6 seconds, while hold-down bolts kept the entire vehicle pinned to the launch. Mount. The flight computers verified thrust levels, chamber pressures, and hundreds of other parameters in real time, 7 seconds after liquid engine ignition, with all 4 engines confirmed nominal. The twin solid rocket boosters ignited simultaneously. At that precise moment, the hold-down bolts released, and 5.75 million pounds of machine began to move. Here is the detail about those 7 seconds that deserves more attention than it typically receives. During that window, after the liquid engines have ignited but before the solid boosters commit the flight, computers retain the ability to shut everything down. If any of the 4 liquid engines reports a parameter outside its acceptable range, the system can abort. The engines cut off the hold-down bolts, stay engaged, and the mission does not launch. 7 seconds of diagnostic verification standing between a normal day at Kennedy Space Center and the irreversible commitment of sending human beings toward the moon. Once those solid rocket boosters light, that option disappears entirely. Solid propellant, unlike liquid fuel, cannot be throttled, cannot be stopped, and cannot be unignited by any system aboard the vehicle. The decision at that point belongs entirely to physics. This is worth sitting with. The entirety of the crew's last opportunity to not go through automated systems at least exists within a 7-second window that most observers watching from miles away would not even perceive as a pause, and then it closes forever. Once the vehicle cleared the launch tower and began its climb, the pace of automated decision-making inside the flight computers accelerated to a rate that no human crew could match or meaningfully participate in. During the ascent phase, the onboard computers were executing thousands of individual control decisions per second, adjusting engine gimbal angles to maintain the correct trajectory, monitoring hundreds of sensor feeds simultaneously, calculating real-time corrections for atmospheric wind shear, and managing the precise throttle-down sequence timed to reduce aerodynamic stress on the vehicle as it passed through the region of maximum dynamic pressure at approximately 45 seconds after liftoff. The 4 crew members in the capsule at the top of that stack were during this phase passengers in the most literal sense of the word. They were monitoring their own displays, aware of the vehicle's status, trained to respond to specific emergency scenarios. But the 8 minutes of powered ascent was fundamentally a performance by software and hardware, not by human, hands-on controls. This fact is simultaneously reassuring and quietly clarifying, because software is written by people, tested by people, and validated by the same institutional processes that had already produced the heat shield decision. 2 minutes after liftoff, at an altitude of approximately 45 kilometers and a velocity approaching 5,000 kilometers per hour, roughly 4 times the speed of a rifle bullet, and the boosters had not yet finished their rifle job. The solid rocket casings separated from the core stage and fell away toward the Atlantic Ocean. At that velocity and altitude, the vehicle was already operating in a regime where the human body's intuitive sense of speed becomes completely meaningless. 5,000 kilometers per hour sounds fast in the context of a car on a highway. In the context of what the vehicle still needed to accomplish to reach orbit, it was just the beginning. The core stage engines continued burning for another 6 minutes after booster separation, accelerating the vehicle through progressively thinner atmosphere toward the boundary of space. At main engine cutoff, approximately 8 minutes and 30 seconds after liftoff, the rocket was traveling at approximately 27,000 kilometers per hour. The core stage separated and began its tumbling descent toward the ocean. The interim cryogenic propulsion stage, the upper stage, fired its single engine to push Orion into a low parking orbit. Then, roughly 2 hours after launch, that upper stage fired again for approximately 18 minutes in what is called the translunar injection burn, the maneuver that committed the spacecraft to its trajectory toward the moon. At the completion of that burn, the crew was no longer in Earth orbit. They were in cislunar space on a path shaped not by continuous thrust, but by the interplay of gravitational fields falling toward the moon. The way a thrown stone falls in a curve, the direction of travel is forward, but the hand of gravity is always pulling. There is a moment of involuntary humour embedded in the final hours of the launch countdown that cuts through the technical gravity of everything surrounding it in a way that no public affairs office would have chosen to highlight. In the final minutes before liftoff, a warning appeared in the countdown data regarding the battery status of the flight termination system, the pyrotechnic apparatus designed to destroy the rocket if it deviated from its approved flight corridor. and posed a threat to populated areas. This system is not optional. Without a verified functioning flight termination system, the range safety officer cannot authorize a launch over inhabited territory. The technical team needed to verify the battery immediately. The verification equipment they reached for was hardware that dated to the Space Shuttle program diagnostic tools designed and manufactured in the 1980s, retrieved and pressed into service to confirm the operational status of components aboard the most powerful human-rated rocket ever built. The most advanced launch vehicle in history certified for flight using instrumentation that predated the commercial internet. The launch proceeded on schedule. If you had 7 seconds, the last 7 seconds, before an irreversible commitment to a 10-year mission you had prepared your entire career for, would you use them to stop it? The rocket left the ground successfully. But the real challenge did not begin at the launch pad. It began at the boundary, where Earth's magnetic field could no longer reach them, and what waited beyond that boundary was invisible, odorless, colorless, and capable of breaking DNA from the inside out. For approximately 4 billion years, life on Earth has existed inside a magnetic cocoon so effective and so constant that evolution never needed to develop a single mechanism to cope with what exists outside it. The magnetosphere, the invisible field generated by the churning of molten iron in Earth's outer core, deflects the overwhelming majority of the high-energy particle radiation that streams continuously through the solar system. Every organism that has ever lived on this planet, from the first single-celled prokaryotes to every human being who has ever drawn breath, developed entirely within this shield. The human immune system has sophisticated responses to bacteria, viruses, fungi, and parasites accumulated across billions of years of evolutionary pressure. It has no comparable response to galactic cosmic rays because no ancestor of ours ever needed one. We are biologically optimized for a protected environment that we are now, for the first time in our species' history, choosing to leave. When the Artemis II crew crossed beyond the outer Van Allen belt and entered cislunar space, their bodies entered a radiation environment that human physiology has never been shaped by natural selection to navigate. This is not a manageable gap that better equipment can fully bridge. It is a fundamental mismatch between the environment our biology was built for and the environment our curiosity is now driving us toward. The most counterintuitive aspect of deep space radiation is the problem with shielding. Common intuition suggests that more shielding equals more protection. Add enough material between a person and a radiation source, and eventually the radiation stops. For some types of radiation, this is true. For galactic cosmic rays, protons, and heavier atomic nuclei, accelerated to velocities approaching the speed of light by supernova shockwaves and other violent astrophysical events, the relationship between shielding thickness and protection is not linear and is beyond a certain point actively counterproductive. When a high-energy galactic cosmic ray particle strikes a dense shielding material like lead or iron, it does not simply stop. It shatters, producing a cascade of secondary particles, a spray of lower energy fragments that collectively can deliver a higher radiation dose to the tissue behind the shield than the original single particle would have on its own. Adding more lead does not solve this problem. It makes it worse. The only practical partial solution available with current technology is to use lower density materials, hydrogen-rich polymers, water that produce fewer and less damaging secondary cascades. There is no complete solution. The physics does not offer one. Picture standing in a rainstorm, but each raindrop is a subatomic particle travelling at a significant fraction of the speed of light passing through an umbrella, as though the umbrella is not there passing through a rain jacket, as though it is not there passing through skin and soft tissue and reaching the nucleus of a cell. Most of the time, the particle passes through without hitting anything critical. Sometimes it strikes a DNA strand and breaks it. The cell's repair machinery, which is genuinely remarkable, catches most of these breaks and fixes them correctly. But repair systems are not perfect. Some breaks are repaired incorrectly, leaving a mutation in the genetic code. Most mutations are harmless or are caught by other cellular quality control systems. Some are not. That is where the long-term cancer risk originates, not from a single catastrophic exposure, but from the accumulated probability of repair errors across thousands of individual particle interactions over days and weeks of exposure. What made Artemis II scientifically unprecedented in this specific domain was an experiment that had never been attempted in the history of human spaceflight. Before the mission, each crew member donated blood samples. From those samples, scientists extracted and cultured bone marrow cells, the tissue most sensitive to radiation damage in the human body, responsible for producing all blood cells and critically important to immune function. Those living cells were incorporated into miniaturized organ-on-a-chip devices and loaded aboard the spacecraft. For the duration of the mission, those chips experienced the identical radiation environment as the crew members themselves. After splashdown, scientists will be able to analyze exactly how each individual person's bone marrow cells responded, which repair pathways activated, which mutations occurred, how the damage profile differed between crew members with different genetic backgrounds. No animal proxy, no computer simulation, and no Earth-based radiation experiment can replicate what those chips measured. The data they contain represents the first personalized biological record of deep space radiation exposure in human history, and it will inform the radiation protection strategies for every crewed mission beyond low Earth orbit that follows. The solar environment during Artemis II added a layer of uncertainty that no amount of biological preparation could eliminate. In August of 1972, in the interval between the Apollo 16 and Apollo 17 missions, the Sun produced one of the most energetic solar particle events recorded in the 20th century. The proton flux during that storm was extraordinary. According to radiation biology, estimates a crew in transit between Earth and the Moon at that moment would have received a dose sufficient to cause acute radiation syndrome nausea, vomiting, compromised immune function, and depending on the duration, of exposure at peak flux, potentially fatal outcomes for at least one crew member. The Apollo program survived that storm by the accident of its own schedule. There was no crew in deep space when it happened. Artemis II launched during a period when the Sun remained in an elevated state of activity following its recent solar maximum. Space weather forecasters monitoring solar X-ray flux and coronal activity in the days surrounding the launch describe the situation as dynamic and difficult to predict with confidence. The Sun does not consult mission timelines. If you knew before boarding that this journey would statistically shorten your life by several years, would that change your decision to go? Radiation can at least be measured, tracked, and partially anticipated. What was waiting for the crew on the far side of the Moon could not be measured by any instrument aboard the spacecraft. It was absolute silence, and psychology has documented what that particular kind of silence can do to the human mind in ways that no one fully predicted until people actually experienced it. For the entirety of the 300,000 years that anatomically modern humans have existed on this planet, no individual member of our species has ever been more than a certain maximum distance from every other living human being. That distance never formally codified, never consciously maintained as a threshold held through every ice age, migration, every ocean crossing in primitive watercraft, every polar expedition, every solo circumnavigation of the globe. The most geographically isolated people in recorded history, whether marooned on uninhabited Pacific atolls or wintering alone at Antarctic research stations, remained within a range that measured against the scale of space placed them, essentially in the same room as the rest of humanity. When the Artemis II crew reached their maximum distance from Earth at approximately 402,000 kilometers from the planet's surface, that boundary, 300,000 years old, was displaced for the first time in the history of the human species. The outermost edge of where a living person has ever stood, shifted outward by thousands of kilometers quietly without ceremony. On a Tuesday in April of 2026, the radio blackout that occurs when a spacecraft passes behind the Moon is simple enough to describe in technical terms. The Moon's diameter is approximately 3,474 kilometers. Electromagnetic signals travel in straight lines through vacuum. When the Orion capsule's trajectory carried it into the geometric cone of lunar shadow relative to Earth, the solid body of the Moon occupied the direct line of propagation between every transmitter on Earth and every receiver on the M spacecraft. No relay satellite existed on the far side to bridge the gap. No signal could bend around the obstacle. Communication ended because physics did not permit it to continue, and it would not resume until the spacecraft's orbital path carried it back into line of sight on the other side. But the blackout is only the engineering description of what those minutes contained. The experiential reality reaches somewhere the technical language does not go. When the Orion capsule crossed fully into the moon's shadow, Earth did not merely become unreachable, it ceased to exist in the crew's visible sky. For the entire outbound journey, 4 days of coasting through cislunar space, Earth had been visible through the windows, shrinking with each passing hour, but always present, always the brightest and most immediately recognizable object in the crew's field of view. It was the one fixed reference point that connected the interior of a spacecraft to the concept of a world that contained everything familiar. Behind the far side of the moon, that reference point was physically blocked by 3,000 kilometers of rock. The sky from that position contains the sun, an unfiltered star field of extraordinary density and clarity, and the ancient surface of the moon itself extending to the horizon in every direction. What it does not contain is any sign that Earth exists at all. There is no blue glow at the edge of the lunar horizon. There is no pale dot visible against the blackness. The planet that produced the crew, that contains everyone they have ever known, that represents the totality of human civilization across all of recorded history. It is simply absent from the sky. The psychological literature on isolation has been accumulating for decades, and NASA has invested significantly in understanding its implications through programs designed specifically to simulate long-duration space mission condition. The HIC's analog studies conducted on the slopes of Mauna Loa in Hawaii placed crews of 6 volunteers in confined habitats for periods extending up to 8 months, studying how small group dynamics evolve under conditions of sustained confinement and communication delay. The findings consistently pointed toward a counterintuitive conclusion about the primary source of psychological stress in these environments. It was not the physical hardship, not the monotony of the routine, not the absence of external stimulation. The dominant source of accumulated tension was the inescapability of the social environment itself. The knowledge that the same small group of individuals would occupy the same shared space every waking hour, with no mechanism for the kind of casual social variety and distance that human nervous systems appear to require for baseline equilibrium. 4 people had been living in a capsule, offering roughly 82 cubic feet of personal space each for nearly 6 days before they reached the far side. The HIC's data suggests the social texture of those 6 days would already have acquired a particular quality that the first day did not have. To anchor the distance of 402,000 kilometers in spatial terms that the human imagination can engage with, rather than simply acknowledge a non-stop commercial flight from New York to Los Angeles covers approximately 4,500 kilometers in roughly 5.5 hours. To travel 402,000 kilometers by the same route, flying continuously without landing, without refueling, without any interruption whatsoever, would require completing that transcontinental crossing more than 89 times in an unbroken sequence. Not 89 flights with connections and layovers, 89 consecutive back-to-back crossings of the continental United States end to end before the distance is covered. The number 402,000 can be read aloud in less than 2 seconds. The reality it describes is not a large version of a familiar distance. It is a categorically different kind of distance operating in a register where the human spatial nervous system, calibrated by evolution for navigating environments measured in tens or hundreds of meters, has no useful intuitive reference available. There is a detail about the Artemis II mission that arrives at exactly the right moment to puncture any remaining inflation of the mission's cosmic grandeur with something thoroughly and irreducibly mundane. The Orion capsule was equipped with a functioning Wi-Fi network. The crew could transmit data, conduct audio and video conferences with flight surgeons and mission controllers, and exchange messages with family members through the Deep Space Network's global antenna infrastructure. At a distance of 400,000 kilometers, the one-way travel time for a radio signal moving at the speed of light exceeds 1 full second. A conversational exchange question and answer statement and response carries an unavoidable round-trip communication delay of more than 2 seconds minimum, which is sufficient to make the natural rhythm of spoken conversation feel permanently broken, every reply arriving just late enough to feel like the other person is not quite listening. This is without meaningful competition the worst network latency ever experienced by a human being conducting a Wi-Fi-enabled communication. And unlike every other context in which a person has encountered frustrating connectivity performance, there was no customer service number to call, no equipment to reboot, no alternative provider to consider, and no possibility of simply driving to a location with better reception. What would run through your mind during the minutes when you are completely cut off from every sound, every signal, and every other human being remaining on Earth? They passed through that silence and came back. But the journey home carried the most terrifying thing of all, a heat shield heating to temperatures equal to half the surface of the sun, and no one truly knowing whether it would hold. $93 billion is a figure that loses its meaning almost immediately upon being stated, because the human mind does not have a reliable, intuitive sense of the difference between 1 billion and 100 billion. Both are simply a very large amount of money, and the distinction between them collapses into abstraction before it can do any useful cognitive work. So before examining what that number represents in the context of Artemis II, it is worth placing it in a frame of reference where its scale becomes visceral rather than merely nominal. $93 billion is roughly what it would cost to build, fully staff and operate the Mayo Clinic, one of the most sophisticated medical institutions in the United States, for approximately 30 consecutive years. Alternatively, it would be sufficient to fund full 4-year university scholarships for every single resident of the state of Ohio across an entire generation. It represents the cumulative investment that the United States government made in the space launch system and the Orion spacecraft between the program's inception and the first crewed lunar flyby mission. This is not offered as a moral judgment about whether that investment was wise or wasteful. It is offered purely as a calibration tool, a way of holding the actual scale of the decision in one hand while examining the structure that produced it with the other. The economic architecture underlying the space launch system's cost profile has a specific mechanism at its center that explains a great deal about how $93 billion was spent and why the trajectory from initial budget projections to final actuals followed the path. It did. The primary contracts for developing and building the SLS core stage were structured on a cost-plus basis, meaning the contractors were reimbursed for all expenses actually incurred during the work, plus a predetermined profit margin, calculated as a percentage of those costs. The contractual incentive embedded in this structure is not subtle. A contractor operating under cost-plus terms receives more total revenue when costs are higher, not lower. There is no financial reward for solving a problem efficiently, and there is a direct financial consequence in the form of lower total billings for solving it quickly. This is the contractual equivalent of hiring a home renovation contractor who is paid by the hour with a guaranteed markup on materials. The job will be done eventually, but the contractor's financial interests and the client's financial interests point in directly opposite directions from the first day of work. Applied to a program building the most complex launch vehicle in history over more than a decade with no competitive pressure to drive efficiency, the cost-plus structure produced outcomes that surprised no one who understood the incentive architecture in advance. The contrast presented by SpaceX's Starship development program is not comfortable for defenders of the existing approach, and it is not invoked here for the purpose of making them more uncomfortable than the facts already require. Starship, standing approximately 120 meters tall at full configuration, produces a liftoff thrust approaching twice that of the Space Launch System. It is designed from its foundational engineering philosophy around full and rapid reusability. Both the Super Heavy booster stage and the Starship upper stage are intended to return to the launch site, be inspected, refueled, and fly again, within timeframes measured in hours to days rather than years. According to preliminary estimates, and these figures carry significant uncertainty and should be understood as projections rather than verified costs, the per-launch operating cost of a mature, fully reusable Starship system could be lower than a single SLS launch by a factor that, even under conservative assumptions, represents a transformation of the economic equation governing human access to deep space. This comparison does not answer the question of what humanity should do with cheaper access to space. It sharpens the question of how the resources allocated to the goal of reaching the moon should be structured going forward. The geopolitical dimension of the current lunar programs adds a layer of urgency to these economic questions that pure cost-benefit analysis cannot capture on its own. China's lunar exploration program has over the past decade accumulated a track record of meeting stated technical milestones on or ahead of schedule, with a consistency that the international aerospace community has noted and taken seriously. China does not conduct press conferences announcing incremental progress toward medium-term goals. The milestones appear in official planning documents and then they are achieved. The target of landing Chinese astronauts, taikonauts, on the lunar surface by the year 2030 has been formally stated by Chinese space authorities. Based on the pace and technical progression of the Chang'e robotic program, which has already achieved the world's first soft landing on the lunar far side and the first sample return from that region, the international aerospace, analysis community treats 2030 as a credible timeline rather than aspirational rhetoric. The location both programs are targeting is not arbitrary. The lunar South Pole contains permanently shadowed craters, geological features that have not received direct sunlight in billions of years, in which water ice has been confirmed by multiple independent measurements. That ice is not primarily significant as a source of drinking water for future crews, though it would serve that function. Its primary strategic value is thermochemical. Water molecules can be split into hydrogen and oxygen through electrolysis using solar-generated electricity. Hydrogen and oxygen are in the correct mixture ratio rocket propellant, the same propellant that powered the Space Launch System's core stage engines. A facility at the lunar South Pole, capable of mining water ice and processing it into propellant, would function as a refueling infrastructure for deep space missions, eliminating the need to launch all propellant mass from Earth's surface at a cost of thousands of dollars per kilogram. Whoever establishes a sustained operational presence at that specific location controls, in practical terms, the logistics infrastructure of the inner solar system for the foreseeable future. Both the United States and China understand this. Both are planning South Pole operations. They are operating under legal frameworks, the Artemis Accords on one side, the International Lunar Research Station partnership on the other, that are not mutually compatible, and that neither party has any mechanism to enforce on the other. When two superpowers converge on the same geographic point on the Moon, with incompatible legal frameworks and overlapping resource claims, what happens if both arrive at the same time? But the question of money and geopolitics is only the backdrop. The real question, the one that every person watching will have an answer to when the capsule hits the water of the Pacific Ocean, is whether the heat shield held. There is a widespread and persistent misconception about what kills a spacecraft during atmospheric re-entry, and correcting it matters because the truth is significantly more unsettling than the popular version. The common intuition is that a vehicle returning from space burns up due to friction, the same mechanism that warms your hands when you rub them together, rapidly scaled up to catastrophic temperatures. This image is vivid, intuitive, and physically incorrect. At 40,000 kilometers per hour, the Orion capsule was not rubbing against the atmosphere the way a match head scrapes against a striking surface. It was compressing the air directly in front of it so violently, so instantaneously, that the air molecules had no time to flow out of the path of the oncoming object. They piled into each other with such force that the kinetic energy of the collision converted directly and immediately into thermal energy, not through contact with the vehicle's surface, but through the compression of the gas itself. The analogy that captures this most accurately requires nothing more exotic than a bicycle pump. Attach a pump to a tyre valve, push the handle down quickly and touch the metal barrel near the base. It is warm noticeably, sometimes uncomfortably warm, not because any moving part scraped against any other, but because the air inside was compressed rapidly, and the energy of that compression manifested as heat. Now scale that principle to a blunt-nosed spacecraft compressing a column of atmospheric gas at 40,000 kilometers per hour, and the temperature at the stagnation point, the zone directly in front of the heat shield, reaches approximately 2,800 degrees Celsius. Not warm to the touch, not hot enough to melt most metals, hot enough to vaporize them. The atmosphere did not attack the Orion capsule. The Orion capsule attacked the atmosphere, and the atmosphere responded according to the laws of thermodynamics. When the plasma sheath fully enveloped the capsule during peak heating, something happened that extended well beyond the loss of radio communication. In electromagnetic terms, the spacecraft essentially ceased to exist as a detectable object. The ionized gas surrounding the vehicle absorbed and reflected radio frequencies across a wide spectrum, making the capsule electromagnetically opaque to ground-based tracking systems. From the perspective of radar installations and receiving antennas pointed toward the re-entry corridor over the Pacific Ocean, the signal they had been tracking went dark. What replaced it visible to observers on ships in the recovery zone and to cameras positioned on naval vessels was a streak of incandescent light moving across the sky, indistinguishable in appearance from a naturally occurring meteor, except for its trajectory, its timing, and the knowledge that it contained 4 living people and the most consequential heat shield data in the history of the American space program. From inside the capsule, the view through the windows was not a streak. It was a wall, a continuous featureless expanse of white-orange plasma pressed against every pane of glass with no horizon visible, no sky visible, no ocean visible below, just light in every direction for 5 minutes. The physical experience of those 5 minutes inside the capsule deserves more than a passing reference because the numbers involved are not abstract. At peak deceleration, the crew was subjected to gravitational loading between 5 and 6 times the normal force of Earth's gravity. To translate that into bodily terms, a person weighing 70 kilograms on the surface of Earth would at 6 times gravitational loading effectively weigh 420 kilograms. Every organ in the body bears that proportional increase. The lungs must work against a chest wall that feels several times heavier than normal. The diaphragm, the primary muscle driving inhalation, must push upward against a load it was never designed by evolution to overcome routinely. Breathing at 6G is not comfortable. It is a physical task requiring deliberate muscular effort, the kind of effort that untrained individuals cannot sustain reliably. This is precisely why 3 of the 4 Artemis II crew members were military fighter pilots. High-performance combat aircraft regularly subject pilots to G-forces in this range during aggressive maneuvering and the physiological training required to maintain consciousness and cognitive function under those conditions, including the learned technique of straining abdominal and leg muscles to prevent blood from pooling away from the brain, is exactly the preparation that re-entry demands. The 4th crew member, Christina Koch, had her own form of relevant preparation. 10 days of microgravity adaptation, followed by sudden multi-G loading, represents a cardiovascular challenge that no amount of ground-based simulation can perfectly replicate. But the compression garments she and her crewmates wore during re-entry were designed specifically to mitigate the blood pressure effects of that transition. In the Mission Control Facility in Houston, the 5 minutes of plasma blackout were experienced in a manner that no technical training fully prepares a person for. The flight controllers who sat at their consoles as the telemetry feeds went dark were not passive observers. They were engineers and specialists who had invested years, in many cases, the better part of their professional careers in the systems represented by those now frozen displays. They had run the trajectory calculations. They had reviewed the heat shield performance models. They had participated in the flight readiness review that produced the unanimous go decision. And now they were sitting in front of screens showing the last received data unchanged because there was nothing to update them. No command they could transmit would reach the vehicle through the plasma. No query they could send would receive a response. The outcome of 5 minutes of atmospheric physics, the product of thermodynamic forces operating on a heat shield that everyone in that room knew had already failed once, was being determined entirely without their participation. The flight controllers did what the only available option allowed. They waited. Meanwhile, the avcoat material on the heat shield surface was undergoing the process it was designed to undergo. And the question that had haunted the program for 3.5 years was in the process of being answered empirically, definitively, and irreversibly. The ablative material was charring. It was vaporizing layer by layer, carrying thermal energy away from the underlying structure in the controlled sacrifice that the engineering design specified. But controlled ablation and catastrophic ejection can look similar in their early stages. The difference between avcoat burning away smoothly in a managed gradient and avcoat cracking under internal gas pressure and departing the surface in chunks would not be visible to anyone until the capsule was recovered and the heat, shield surface, examined in detail. The 5 minutes of re-entry were simultaneously the test and the grading period for the most expensive and most controversial engineering decision in the recent history of human spaceflight. In Houston, in those 5 minutes of darkness, what do you think was running through the mind of the flight director sitting at the front console? The screens came back to life. But the real story only began when the capsule hit the water, because what NASA found on the bottom of that spacecraft would determine the future of the entire human spaceflight program. The Orion capsule hit the surface of the Pacific Ocean, approximately 50 kilometers off the coast of San Diego, on the 10th of April 2026, 10 days after it had left the ground at Kennedy Space Center. The splashdown was by every external measure available at the moment of impact a success. The parachute sequence had executed correctly, the airbags had inflated, the capsule was floating upright with the hatch above the waterline. 4 people were alive inside it. By the standards of mission success criteria, the box was checked, but what those 4 people's bodies had been through in the preceding 10 days had left marks that gravity was now very quickly beginning to make impossible to ignore. The human cardiovascular system is a pressure regulation machine of extraordinary sophistication, and it adapts to its environment with a speed and thoroughness that is, depending on your perspective, either impressive or deeply inconvenient. Within 72 hours of entering microgravity, the heart begins recalibrating its output downward. The circulatory system, no longer required to pump blood upward against gravitational resistance from the legs and lower body, redistributes fluid volume toward the upper body and head. Sensors in the major blood vessels detect the increased pressure in the upper circulation and signal the kidneys to reduce total blood volume by excreting more fluid. The heart muscle itself begins a modest process of atrophy, not dramatic, not immediately dangerous, but measurable and real. After 10 days of this adaptation, the crew of Artemis II had cardiovascular systems that had become efficiently optimized for an environment that no longer existed the moment the capsule hit the water. Reintroduction to Earth's gravitational field for a crew adapted to 10 days of weightlessness is not a gradual process. Gravity does not renegotiate. The moment the capsule decelerated from its re-entry trajectory and began bobbing on the ocean surface, every liter of blood in every crew member's body was subject once again to the full 1G downward pull that it had been partially relieved of for 10 days. Fluid that had redistributed upward during the mission now shifted back toward the lower extremities. A cardiovascular system that had reduced its total blood volume and recalibrated its pressure regulation responded to this sudden redemand with all the agility of a system asked to reverse 10 days of adaptation in approximately 10 seconds. Standing upright after extended microgravity exposure produces a combination of lightheadedness, visual disturbance, and coordination impairment that experienced astronauts describe as feeling like wearing a helmet packed with wet concrete. The head is there, it is functioning, but the sensory inputs and the motor responses are processing through a medium that is thicker and slower than it should be. Before any crew member was assisted out of the hatch, before any handshake or photograph or statement to the cameras on the recovery vessel, a Navy dive team in the water adjacent to the floating capsule was conducting a procedure that the public rarely learns about and that the cinematic version of space exploration almost never depicts. The Orion capsule's reaction control system, the network of small thrusters used to orient the vehicle during re-entry and manage its attitude through the atmosphere, uses propellants that include hydrazine compounds. Hydrazine is acutely toxic upon inhalation, capable of causing severe respiratory damage and at sufficient concentration rapid incapacitation or death. Residual hydrazine can accumulate on the exterior surfaces of the vehicle or vent from the propulsion system in the period immediately following splashdown. Before the hatch was opened, before fresh air from the Pacific was allowed to flow into the crew compartment, the dive team was systematically checking the exterior of the capsule for chemical contamination, ensuring that the act of opening the hatch would not introduce toxic vapor into the enclosed space where 4 people were sitting. The spacecraft that had protected the crew from the vacuum of space, from radiation from the plasma of re-entry, represented in its final minutes as a sealed system one more hazard that required management before its occupants could safely exit. The vehicle that kept them alive also needed to be made safe before they could leave it. The heat shield examination that began immediately upon the capsule's arrival aboard the recovery vessel was not a formality. It was, in the most literal sense of the phrase, a trial. With the design decisions of the past several years in the position of the defendant and the physical evidence on the surface of the Avcoat material, serving as the only testimony that, mattered. Every square centimetre of the heat shield's surface was documented. Every void, every gouge, every area of unexpected erosion, every location where material had been ejected rather than ablated in controlled fashion, all of it was measured, photographed, and compared against the pre-mission predictive models. The direct re-entry trajectory that NASA had selected as the solution to the Artemis I failure mode was on trial. The question was whether the changed trajectory had eliminated the gas entrapment mechanism that had caused the earlier damage, or whether the Artemis II crew had survived because the damage happened to remain below the threshold of catastrophic failure, rather than because the fundamental engineering problem had been resolved. Here is the data paradox embedded in that examination, and it deserves to be stated plainly, because it has no comfortable resolution. If the post-flight inspection revealed that the heat shield performed exactly as the updated models predicted, controlled ablation, manageable damage, no evidence of the ejection pattern seen after Artemis I, the decision to fly without. An uncrewed validation test would be retroactively justified, and the program would proceed with increased confidence. But if the inspection revealed damage that exceeded predictions, while the crew nonetheless survived, the conclusion would be simultaneously more troubling and more ambiguous. The design may be worse than the models indicate, but fortunate, enough to have remained on the survivable side of the failure threshold this time. And fortunate enough, this time is not a methodology that scales across multiple missions. Luck is not a parameter that appears in engineering specifications, and it is not a resource that replenishes between missions. There is one final detail about the post-splashdown recovery sequence that lands with a kind of quiet, involuntary humour once the full arc of what these four people have just done is held in view. Among the items on the priority recovery list, the sequence of actions and objects that the recovery team was directed to secure in order of importance following crew extraction. The biological sample containers holding the organ-on-a-chip devices were flagged for immediate cold chain custody. These were the miniaturized chips containing living bone marrow cells from each crew member, which had spent 10 days accumulating biological data about deep space radiation exposure that no Earth-based experiment could replicate, no animal model could adequately approximate. The recovery protocol treated those small chips with the same logistical urgency as a critical medical sample en route to an emergency laboratory. In a mission involving a spacecraft worth billions of dollars, a rocket producing 8.8 million pounds of thrust and hardware, representing decades of institutional investment, the objects designated for the most careful and immediate post-splashdown handling were small enough to fit in a shirt pocket. The human body, it turned out, had been the most scientifically valuable instrument aboard the entire mission. If the post-flight heat shield inspection showed that luck played a larger role than engineering in bringing the crew home safely, how should that finding change? NASA's next decision, the answer to that question, will shape everything that follows Artemis II, and what follows is more ambitious, more dangerous, and more consequential than anything humanity has ever attempted. There is a number that reframes every decision made in the Artemis program, every budget overrun, every schedule delay, every engineering controversy, every institutional failure, and places them inside a context large enough to make them look like what they actually are, not the story but the prologue to the story. That number is 7. As in 7 months, the minimum one-way travel time between Earth and Mars during the most favourable alignment of the two planets' orbits, which occurs once approximately every 26 months. 7 months of continuous transit through deep space, completely outside Earth's magnetic field, with no resupply possible, no evacuation possible, and no communication faster than the speed of light, which at Mars's average distance from Earth introduces a one-way signal delay of between 3 and 22 minutes depending on orbital position. A question sent from a crew in distress would not reach Earth for up to 22 minutes. The answer, if one existed, would not arrive back for another 22 minutes. 44 minutes of silence around a problem that might not wait 44 minutes for a solution. To understand what that constraint actually means at the operational level, consider a scenario with no dramatic exaggeration. A crew is 200 days into a Mars transit mission. The carbon dioxide scrubbing system, the component responsible for removing exhaled carbon dioxide from the crew cabin atmosphere, develops a fault that the crew cannot diagnose from available onboard documentation. On the International Space Station, this problem is solved within hours. Flight controllers on Earth review telemetry, diagnose the fault, uplink a repair procedure, and guide the crew through the fix in real time. On a Mars transit vehicle, the same problem arrives with a communication delay that makes real-time guidance physically impossible. The crew has the tools, the training, and the onboard reference materials they brought with them. They have no other options. They fix it, or they do not come home. This is not a hypothetical designed to manufacture anxiety about a future mission. It is the operational reality that every Mars mission planning document must account for, and it is the reason that every system intended for Mars must first be demonstrated, failure tested, and thoroughly understood in an environment where the failure consequences are severe, but rescue remains, possible within days rather than months. The Moon, at its average distance of approximately 384,000 kilometers, is that environment. 3 days of transit time separates a lunar surface crew from Earth, close enough for emergency resupply in theory, close enough for evacuation procedures to be meaningful, close enough for the kinds of iterative learning that complex system development always requires. The planned South Pole base represents the most ambitious surface construction project in the history of human exploration, and simultaneously the most important engineering education program ever designed. Every crop grown in regolith-based substrate under artificial lighting will produce data that informs the agricultural systems of a Mars habitat. Every kilogram of oxygen extracted from lunar rock through the process of molten regolith electrolysis will validate the life support technology that a Mars crew cannot leave Earth without. Every structural component, printed from sintered lunar dust using solar-powered additive manufacturing equipment, will test the in-situ resource utilization philosophy that makes Mars missions economically conceivable at all, because the alternative launching everything a Mars crew needs from Earth's surface, at a cost of thousands of dollars per kilogram, is not a sustainable model for sustained human presence beyond the Earth-Moon system. The radiation data collected during Artemis II, and particularly the biological data encoded in the organ-on-a-chip devices that were recovered with such careful urgency after splashdown, occupies a specific and irreplaceable position in this preparatory architecture. 10 days beyond the Van Allen belts provided the first personalized biological record of how human bone marrow cells respond to the deep space radiation environment at the individual genetic level. A Mars mission crew will spend 7 months in that same environment, or worse because Mars lacks the global magnetic field that provides even the partial protection available in the Earth-Moon corridor. The chip data from Artemis II is not merely interesting science. It is the first empirical input into the radiation protection design calculations for crewed Mars vehicles, the first data point on a curve that engineers need to draw before they can responsibly sign off on sending people on a journey where the accumulated radiation dose will be measured not in days but in half-year increments. The planned South Pole base, when described in its full operational specification, sounds like the premise of a thought experiment about the limits of human ambition rather than an engineering program with a budget, a timeline, and a contracting structure. No breathable atmosphere. Surface temperatures that can swing 300 degrees Celsius between the permanently shadowed crater floors and the sunlit ridge tops a few hundred meters away. A location chosen specifically because the perpetual darkness of certain craters has preserved water ice deposits for billions of years. But where that same perpetual darkness means that any habitat relying on solar power must be positioned on elevated terrain with line of sight to the sun, across the crater rim. The nearest medical facility equipped to handle a surgical emergency is a 3-day transit away minimum. Building a permanent human settlement in that environment sounds unreasonable. It also sounded unreasonable in 1880 to propose building a city in the Sonoran Desert of Arizona, a place with summer temperatures exceeding 45 degrees Celsius. No natural fresh water sources within practical reach, and no existing infrastructure of any kind. Phoenix, Arizona is currently home to more than 1.6 million people. The unreasonableness of an environment has never, in the long record of human settlement history, been a reliable predictor of whether people will eventually live there. The 10-year-old children who watched the Artemis II launch on the evening of April 1, 2026, will be approximately 34 years old in the year 2050. According to the trajectory roadmaps published by both NASA and SpaceX documents that carry the weight of institutional commitment rather than speculative aspiration, the first crewed Mars landing missions are currently planned for the late 2040s to early 2050s. This alignment is not a coincidence manufactured for rhetorical effect. It reflects the actual pace of the development programs currently underway, the Starship vehicle being tested and refined the lunar South Pole base, providing the operational experience and technology validation that a Mars mission requires, the biological and radiation research data accumulating, mission by mission into a body of knowledge sufficient to underwrite a 7-month transit with reasonable confidence. The child who watched the launch may become the astronaut who plants the first boot print on Martian regolith. That sentence is not metaphor, it is a timeline. If you were selected for a mission that could last 3 years with no guaranteed return date, and you would be among the first human beings to set foot on Mars, would you go? But before all of that ambition, there is a larger question, a question that Artemis II, with all of its imperfections, answered, in a way that no one fully anticipated. Artemis II was by almost every measurable standard available to institutional analysis, the most expensive, the most contested, and the most technically risky crewed spaceflight mission in the history of commercial-era human space. Exploration. The cost overruns were documented and enormous. The heat shield controversy was public and unresolved at launch. The dissenting expert voices were credentialed and specific. The 1 in 2 failure probability estimate came from inside the program itself. Every quantifiable metric of risk, financial prudence, and institutional health pointed toward a mission that should not have been the product of a well-functioning space agency operating at peak capability. And yet, and this is the paradox that sits at the center of everything, Artemis II represents it happened. 4 people flew to the moon and came home. The knowledge was rebuilt. The distance record was broken. The heat shield held. A civilization that had forgotten for 53 years how to send human beings beyond low Earth orbit demonstrated that the memory could be recovered, that the capability could be reconstructed, and that the will to do so had never actually disappeared. It had only been waiting. The neuroscience of what happens to a human brain when it perceives Earth from the distance of the moon has been studied in the decades since Apollo, and the findings are more substantive than the poetic language typically used to describe the experience might suggest. The overview effect, the profound cognitive and emotional shift reported by every astronaut who has seen Earth as a complete sphere from deep space, is not simply an aesthetic response to a beautiful view. Neurological research suggests it involves a measurable reorganization of the brain's processing of identity boundaries and group membership. The categorical distinctions that dominate terrestrial political and social cognition, national identity, ethnic belonging, ideological affiliation, appear to lose their neurological salience when the visual cortex is processing an image of the entire planet as a single unified bounded object floating in an unbounded black void. The person looking at that image does not stop being an American or a Canadian or whatever nationality is encoded in their documents and their upbringing, but the neural weight assigned to that categorical identity relative to the larger identity of being a member of the species that produced the vehicle they are sitting in, and the planet they are looking at, that weighting shifts. Not permanently, not completely, but measurably and consistently across individuals from different national and cultural backgrounds. The overview effect is not a philosophy. It is, according to available evidence, a neurological event. What makes Artemis II historically distinct from every previous mission that produced this effect is the identity of the eyes doing the seeing. The 12 human beings who looked back at Earth from the vicinity of the Moon during the Apollo program were without exception white American men. Their accounts of the overview effect are genuinely moving and have been widely cited and celebrated. But the perspective they brought to that view was shaped by a particular social and historical position. A position that was not universal, that was not representative of the full range of human experience, and that necessarily constrained what their descriptions of the experience could convey to the majority of people on Earth who did not share it. When Christina Koch looked back at Earth from 400,000 kilometers and described what she saw, she was the first woman in history to do so from that distance. When Victor Glover looked back, he was the first person of colour to have that view. When Jeremy Hansen looked back, he was the first non-American. What they bring home in their descriptions of that moment, the specific texture of what it meant to each of them, from where they stood in human history and human society, will carry a weight and a resonance for audiences that the Apollo, accounts however powerful, could not reach. For 53 years between the last Apollo mission and the 1st of April, 2026, an entire body of operational knowledge, accumulated by going to the moon and doing it repeatedly, was allowed to atrophy. The engineers who built the Saturn V retired. The flight controllers who guided Apollo 13 around the moon and back using a lunar module as a lifeboat moved on to other careers. The institutional memory of how to manage lunar return, re-entry heating, how to design free return trajectories, how to provision a crew for 10 days of deep space isolation, all of it persisted in archived documents and retirement. Interviews, but not in the active embodied knowledge of people currently doing the work. Artemis II was not just a mission. It was an act of civilizational memory recovery, the deliberate, expensive, technically controversial reconstruction of a capability that the species had possessed and then, through inattention and changing priorities, very nearly lost. The heat shield cracked, the budget overran, the institutional dynamics were troubled, and the mission succeeded anyway, which is perhaps the most honest possible summary of how humanity has always done the things that matter most. The heat shields may crack, the budgets may overrun, politics may interfere at every stage, but something in the deep structure of this species, not rational calculation, not economic optimization, compels a continued interrogation of the next horizon. That quality is not a flaw to be corrected. It is the reason we are still here after 300,000 years. 4 people came home, the shield held, and the moon patient silent, having waited 53 years, is waiting for the next footstep. Is the thing that defines humanity, not language, not tools, but the inability to stop asking questions that have no answers. Yet the force that will carry us to the stars, or the force that will destroy us on the way there.